Howdy y'all, my name is Dave. This is the Anime Field Guide podcast, and you are listening to the Studio Rundown. This is my series where I take you through the history and business practices of anime production houses across Japan. Today's featured episode is the iconic Studio Ghibli. Before I get going, a quick special thank you to Dark Cat for the theme music. That is Lover's Oasis. Thank you, Dark Cat, for posting it on Upbeat and making the song available. Give them some love over on Spotify as well. Now, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Studio Ghibli is the most well-known animation house in Japan, accompanied by a slew of awards at home and abroad, and an enduring legacy of nostalgia for over 4 decades. Ghibli is that kind of a cultural icon, and its impact both on the anime industry and the media landscape in general is almost impossible to calculate. And so I see this as my very small contribution to the wealth of coverage for the studio and its founders, whose personal biographies basically go hand in hand with the studio that they founded. And these men are, of course, Hayao Miyazaki, Isao Takahata, and Toshio Suzuki. So starting with Miyazaki, in 1963, he was hired by Toei Animation and worked as an in-betweener on the feature film Doggy March, as well as Toei's first ever television series Wolf Boy Ken. Miyazaki also worked on Gulliver's Travels, Beyond the Moon, Puss in Boots, and Animal Treasure Island. He also became involved with Toei's labor union in 1964, becoming its head. This is where he would also meet eventual Ghibli co-founder, collaborator, and friend Isao Takahata. In 1965, Takahata directed the feature film Horus, Prince of the Sun. Miyazaki was on setting and key animation. In 1971, Miyazaki and Takahata left Toei and transferred to A Productions, where they worked on Lupin III Part 1 as episode directors. This is also where Miyazaki got his start as an episode director. He started with Lupin, and Lupin is very important to his career. They also wanted to create an animated feature film for Pippi Longstocking, but couldn't reach an agreement with the author, so instead they took the ideas and created a 30-minute short film, Panda Ko Panda, released it in 1972 when a pair of Chinese pandas were then loaned to the Ueno Zoo and were very popular. So naturally the film did very well in the middle of this panda craze and got a sequel movie in 1973, again Isao Takahata directing with Miyazaki on art design and layouts and such. They then transferred to Studio Zoyo Aizo, where in 1974 Takahata directed the landmark anime series Heidi Girl of the Alps, with Miyazaki on layouts and settings again. Another transfer, this time to Nippon Animation for 1978's Future Boy Conan, which was Miyazaki's directorial debut for television, although a lot of his contributions to that series go uncredited as far as what was going on at the time. But for all intents and purposes, basically with hindsight, Miyazaki has gotten his flowers as, yes, you were basically the director on Future Boy Conan. And checking back in with Takahata, in 1979, he directed Anne of Green Gables. This ran for 50 episodes, and through 1980 and through 1983, he would then adapt the popular manga Chie the Brat, the manga by Etsumi Haruka. He did it into a feature film in 1980, and then a 64-episode television series from October 1981 to March of 83. Also in 1979 was Hayao Miyazaki's feature film directorial debut, this being Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro, with the studio this time was Tokyo Movie Shinsa. This had a modest theater returns, but for its time it was highly praised for its direction and animation style. Miyazaki was asked to direct another Lupin film, but he turned it down, although he did work on a couple of episodes of Lupin III Part 2, including the series finale, that being episode 155. Because fresh off the success of Cagliostro, Miyazaki was approached by Animage magazine, by this magazine owned by the major publishing house Tokuma Shoten, and they approached him for a featured article. One editor in particular had been following Miyazaki's career, this man being Toshio Suzuki. And so during the interview, Miyazaki also pitched various animation projects to Animage's editor, Osamu Kaneyama, and of course Suzuki. These proposals were rejected. However, from that meeting, Toshio Suzuki encouraged Miyazaki to turn one of those proposals into a manga for Animage. This was Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which began its run in February of 1982 and would run until 1994, collected into 7 volumes total. But through 1982 and going into 83, Nausicaa was so immediately successful that Miyazaki was quickly approached by Tokuma Shoten's founder, Yasuyoshi Tokuma, to adapt the manga into animation. But again, this is Miyazaki's grand plan. Just make a best-selling manga and then just get that adapted into a film. Everything works out, easy peasy. Miyazaki would direct the film, and then Takahata was brought on as executive producer, but of course he was working on Chie the Brat. So Tokuma did not own an animation studio, so it was basically up to Takahata to track down a suitable workplace, as Miyazaki was also in the planning stages for Tokyo Movie's television series Sherlock Hound. And so for Nausicaa, they selected Studio Topcraft. This is the animation house for Rankin Bass Productions. You have The Last Unicorn. They worked on The Hobbit. They did Return of the King, Season 1 of Thundercats, and The Smurfs. And so work on Nausicaa began in early 1983 with Miyazaki in the director's chair and Takahata involved as a producer role. Nausicaa was released to theaters in March 1984 to massive critical and commercial success, which then convinced Miyazaki, Takahata, and Suzuki to continue their partnership. And they would get this opportunity when Topcraft declared bankruptcy in early 1985 and was dissolved. The animators had then left to form Pacific Animation Company to continue working on Thundercats and the Smurfs. They also worked on Silverhawks and other shows as well. This was then bought out by the Walt Disney Company and rebranded as Walt Disney Animation Japan. Then those animators joined Studio Ghibli, which was founded on June 17, 1985 by directors Hayao Miyazaki and Takahata and producer Toshio Suzuki, with financial assistance from Tokuma Shoten Publishing and acquiring the assets of Topcraft Studio. Tokuma Shoten was also the parent company of Ghibli. And they continued to have a close relationship with the two companies naturally. Animage Magazine would regularly run featured articles and interviews for Studio Ghibli and its films, hyping up its new projects. Even after the studio went independent from Tokuma, there's always been a close relationship between these two companies. Now, the name Ghibli was chosen by Miyazaki from the Italian noun Ghibli, that was the nickname of Italy's Saharan scouting plane from World War II. This was the Caproni CA-309, which in turn derived from the Italianization of the Libyan Arabic name for a hot desert wind. This name was chosen both for his passion for the aircraft and flying in general, and also for the idea that Studio Ghibli would blow a hot new wind through the anime industry. The studio would focus exclusively on high-quality animated theatrical films. The first of these movies was Laputa, Castle in the Sky, the studio's debut film in 1986, another massive commercial success. Tokuma commissioned an English dub with Carl Masek's Streamline Pictures in 1988, and these I believe they were originally made for in-flight movies, like international flights. Streamline would also dub My Neighbor Totoro and Kiki's Delivery Service. Isao Takahata's directorial feature for the new studio was The Story of Yanagawa's Canals. This is a live-action documentary with supplemental animation by Miyazaki about the history of Yanagawa in the Fukuoka Prefecture and its citizens' struggles with water pollution in the historical canals. The movie began production in 1984 and was funded by half the profits from Nausicaa, but spent 3 years in production and repeatedly ran over budget. Miyazaki even contributed his own personal funds to complete the film, which was released in August 1987 and broadcast on NHK. However, the financial returns nowhere near made up the cost. The only DVD release of this film was Japan only in 2003 and would later be featured at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in 2022 as part of the Isao Takahata exhibit. And despite the financial gulfs between these two projects, both movies featured strong themes of environmentalism, community, and reconciliation, key things that would define Studio Ghibli, even though the canal documentary would just make Miyazaki's eye twitch. Then in 1988 came the infamous double billing release of Miyazaki's My Neighbor Totoro, which was a children's movie about a fluffy nature spirit, and Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies, one of the more iconic Japanese anti-war films where a brother and sister slowly starve to death while the city gets bombed by the Allied forces. Production on both films was this nightmare of endless work, and the financial returns were relatively modest, but both movies remain iconic for their own reasons. Now, while Totoro on the Miyazaki side may be seen as, okay, it's like an early look, or compared to his later works, or even prior, Totoro may be seen as like an underrated part of his catalog. But again, this still has the strong themes of environmentalism and community. Totoro himself has become one of these symbols of conservation and environmental, like eco-friendly stuff. Because Totoro himself, he also would become the studio's main mascot character, because he's this cross between a cute little raccoon dog, he's got cat-like mannerisms, and he's just the biggest, fluffiest, cuddliest bear-looking thing you've ever seen. Almost like little rabbit ears on top of him as well. There was a lot of merchandise made from this big fella. They had literal truckloads of fan mail after this movie asking for plushies and the such. For Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies, again, this is one of the more, it endures as a outstanding humanist work for the cost of war upon a community and working through hardship, even despite the tragic ending of that movie. And so moving along, we have 1989, which is my personal favorite movie by Miyazaki. It's Kiki's Delivery Service. In 1991, Takahata swung with Only Yesterday. In 1992, Miyazaki returned with Porco Rosso. And in 1993, we have the first Ghibli film not directed by Miyazaki or Takahata. This is Ocean Waves, directed by Tomomi Mochizuki. Ocean Waves was supposed to be a film project for the young staff members at Ghibli to work on, the 20s and the mid-30s somethings, with also outside production with JC Staff, Madhouse, and O Productions, but repeatedly ran over schedule and over budget. It's a slightly somber coming-of-age film. There's also no fantastical elements to it at all. It's very character, very dialogue-driven, but it's a film that it's not flashy really in any respects, but it's a film that I appreciate more now that I'm an adult. So in 1994, we have Pom Poko, directed by Takahata, and also the first time Studio Ghibli used computer graphics in addition to traditional animation. We have 1995's Whisper of the Heart, directed by Yoshifumi Kondo, who'd done character designs on Sherlock Hound, Grave of the Fireflies, and Only Yesterday. Screenplay was by Miyazaki. Now, Yoshifumi Kondo worked with Miyazaki and Takahata as far back as Lupin III, key animation on Panda Copanda and Future Boy Conan. He also did character designs across Anne of Green Gables, and joined Studio Ghibli starting with Grave of the Fireflies. Again, he was a character designer on that. I also want to shout out the music of Joe Hisaishi, who has composed for every one of Miyazaki's movies starting from Nausicaa all the way to The Boy and the Heron. And so after this early output and through a solid string of the early to mid-90s, in August of 1996, the Walt Disney Company and Tokuma Shoten signed a 15-year partnership wherein Walt Disney Studios would be the sole international distributor for Studio Ghibli's animated films, while also agreeing to finance 10% of the studio's production costs. Miyazaki's previous films that were dubbed by Streamline were also redubbed by Disney, so Laputa, Totoro, and Kiki were all redubbed by Disney. And in 1997, we have Princess Mononoke, which Miyazaki had been working on since the early 90s as well. It was to be his most ambitious film for the studio to date, the first one to be released under the new agreement, also with a worldwide release. It was also the most expensive animated film produced in Japan at the time, and another just long, torturous production process for this studio. But the returns were incredible. The critical and commercial hits in Japan, this was basically considered to be Miyazaki's magnum opus. He'd been working now in the anime industry for 34 years and basically put his heart and soul into making Princess Mononoke a success. However, that success came at a cost. Because of the torturous production cycle on this movie, there was a heavy staff burnout following the completion of the film, with some folks leaving the studio entirely. Also, more personally, Yoshifumi Kondo passed away in 1998 from a sudden aneurysm said to have been brought on by excess work. Because leading up to this, there had been more than a few substantial rumors about Yoshifumi-san potentially succeeding Miyazaki in the future. And this death was a big hit, both to Miyazaki and to everyone at the studio. It was a huge loss for everyone in the company. It's also speculated to be a big reason for Miyazaki announcing his first retirement. Princess Mononoke had a rougher time in the United States. The film was dubbed in English at Miramax Films, which was a Disney subsidiary at the time, with old Harvey Weinstein Scissorhands at the helm. His previous outing with Studio Ghibli had been the notorious Warriors of the Wind cut of Nausicaa. Well, it was more of a butchering than a cut, and this is where you get the story or the legend of Toshio Suzuki sending Weinstein an authentic samurai sword with the tag, "No cuts." So ultimately, Princess Mononoke was dubbed in full, but Weinstein clapped back with minimal marketing as well as limiting its theatrical run, which resulted in low box office returns and also caused delays in other Disney dub projects at the time for at least a couple of years. But Princess Mononoke was big, really big. But at the same time, it was also a very specifically Japanese movie. There was a lot of issues, issues, yes, but confusion or just a lot of lost in translation on the English side, a lot of difficulty getting there. So yes, the movie was very highly praised for its animation and its direction, but again, it was a very just so hyper specifically focused on the Japanese audience that just there was going to be details lost for the general audience over here in the United States and worldwide. In 1999, Isao Takahata directed My Neighbors the Yamadas. Adapting a popular 4-panel gag manga, Takahata wanted this film to have a very specific watercolor art style and a specific movement, so they pioneered a computer animation technique to achieve this look, which makes My Neighbors the Yamadas the first movie by Studio Ghibli to be painted and animated entirely by computers. But this process was also very expensive because, of course, they were pioneering new techniques, and so a lot of experimentation along the way. It was also not very successful commercially, but this was a major animation milestone and would also be important for another film which Takahata would direct over a decade later. But in 2001, this of course brings us to Miyazaki and Spirited Away, the smash hit and absolute global sensation. In Japan, Spirited Away comfortably eclipsed Princess Mononoke's returns as the top-grossing film in Japan and drew in extra millions across the world, and that's before the home video money started pouring in. Spirited Away is the film that rocketed Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki onto the world stage, turned them both into a household name, also thanks in part that I have to give this out to John Lasseter of Pixar. Yes, he is a scumbag, but I will not deny him the credit that he deserves in this aspect. Spirited Away took home the 2003 Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, which was the first traditional animated non-English film to be awarded this honor. However, Miyazaki did not attend the award ceremony because of his protests against the US and the Iraq War. Also in 2001, the Ghibli Museum opened in Mitaka, Tokyo, which is the start of Studio Ghibli as really an entertainment brand in addition to being a movie studio. Yes, they had the merch from Totoro and the other movies and such, but this is a full-on museum deal. And so this was designed by Miyazaki beginning in 1998 and then constructed in 2000. The museum features special exhibits and exclusive short films made by Miyazaki and other directors. Also in 2002, we have The Cat Returns, directed by Hiroyuki Morita. We had 2004's Howl's Moving Castle. This was originally given to Mamoru Hosoda to direct, who had been working at Toei at the time. However, they had multiple disagreements about the direction of the film. The project had to be shelved a couple of times, so Hosoda-san stepped away from the project, and then Miyazaki stepped in to direct the film. And after this, again, he announced another retirement. It's more accurate to say, I think, instead of outright retiring, it's more like to say like Miyazaki's output slowed down. He focused on producing a couple of exclusive short films for the Ghibli Museum. Also in April of 2005, Studio Ghibli becomes an independent company from Tokuma Shoten while they still retain the distribution agreement with Disney. And in 2006, we have Tales from the Earthsea, directed by Goro Miyazaki, who is the son of Hayao Miyazaki. Goro-san was the architect for the parks and the gardens and was involved in the design and construction of the Ghibli Museum, also served as its director from 2001 to 2005 before changing careers to animation. Now, as far as Tales from the Earthsea, this is the definition of a mixed reception, especially given the pressure on Goro Miyazaki leading up to its release and being touted as this is going to be the film that cements him as the new successor to Hayao Miyazaki's legacy and all of this great things. But it was something that Hayao Miyazaki saw the film and went, okay, I got to do something about this. And so in 2008, Miyazaki returns to film with Ponyo. And Ponyo is almost like a statement piece by Miyazaki, because beginning with Spirited Away, the studio had employed more like hand animation and then had been increasingly adding in more like these digital smoothing techniques to really give a distinct look to the film. But Miyazaki had also been grumbling about this incursion of computers. And so Ponyo was to be a return to form for the studio. we're going to return to full traditional animation. This is going to be, we built the studio's reputation on traditional animation. This is going to be hand animated, basically entirely so, with very minimal computers. And again, another retirement announcement by Miyazaki. I'm done for real. This is it. And so going into the 2010s and through all of this, it had become very apparent that Studio Ghibli was looking for a successor to Hayao Miyazaki. He also had a reputation for being very controlling and also heavily altering projects, a my way or the highway sentiment, or outright just taking over a project, especially after Spirited Away. This resulted in a slow but steady, what I would call like a brain drain on the studios, as artists left for other studios or formed their own. We had talented creatives like Kazuo Oga, Sanao Katabuchi, Masashi Ando. They built their reputations at Studio Ghibli and then springboarded that into careers outside of the studio, either from personal disagreements with Miyazaki or Suzuki or anywhere at the studio, or just they weren't feeling like they were getting the opportunities that they were ready for. A lot of these folks, like Sanao Katabuchi and Masashi Ando, didn't have their directorial debuts until finally leaving Studio Ghibli. One of these potential successors at the time was Hiromasa Yonebayashi. He directed 2010's The Secret World of Arrietty, or Arrietty the Borrower, and 2014's When Marnie Was There. And Yonebayashi had been working with Ghibli as an animator since Princess Mononoke and had been tutored by Miyazaki. However, he left the company after finishing Marnie, moving over to Studio Ponok with a bunch of fellow Ghibli animators. He was the director of Mary and the Witch's Flower. Although Yonebayashi did return for key animation on The Boy and the Heron, he's pretty much over at Studio Ponok full-time. Also, I already mentioned Goro Miyazaki, and going through his output, we of course had Tales from the Earthsea in 2006, From Up on Poppy Hill in 2011, but this is also a screenplay by Miyazaki and Hayao Miyazaki, and you can pretty much tell it doesn't feel like a Goro Miyazaki film. You have Ronja the Robber's Daughter, one of the few TV series produced by the studio. This is in 2014, and also the movie Earwig and the Witch, the full CG film that was released by the studio in 2020. More on that later. In 2011, the exclusivity deal with Walt Disney expired, and so the company G-Kids picked up the North American theatrical rights to Ghibli films beginning in September 2011, but Walt Disney still held on to the home video rights, and they still were printing Blu-rays of the Ghibli catalog through the early to mid-2010s. 2013 also saw the release of Miyazaki's then penultimate film, The Wind Rises, after he said, "This is for sure my last one. I'm retiring for real." As for Isao Takahata, he'd taken more of a backseat role and a producer after My Neighbors the Yamadas. And around the time Miyazaki announced his retirement, Takahata came out and announced that he was working on his last film, which would be 2013's The Tale of Princess Kaguya. This is the retelling of the 10th century epic The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. I really loved this film, and it was drawn and animated using the techniques pioneered from My Neighbors the Yamadas. 2014 was a pivotal year for the company, and one that I remember very clearly. And so it begins in March. You have Toshio Suzuki retiring from his role as the producer and becoming the general manager. And in August, Suzuki-san announced that he had had concerns about the future of Studio Ghibli and that the company would take a brief pause to reevaluate and restructure after Miyazaki's retirement following The Wind Rises. And this was a pretty big exodus. Like, people have been exiting Studio Ghibli before, but this was basically a mass exodus from Studio Ghibli. Several animators were picked up by outside studios. Hiromasa Yonebayashi and others formed Studio Ponok. In 2016, we had the Dutch animated film The Red Turtle. It was announced that this was a co-production with Studio Ghibli. Isao Takahata was acting as the artistic producer on the project, but he was also battling lung cancer at the time. And also in 2016, Miyazaki announced his return to theatrical animation, one last ride, for real this time. The film in question wouldn't come out until 2023. How do you live? I had to say it like that, that being The Boy and the Heron. In 2017, the plans were announced for a Ghibli theme park, with a projected opening in 2020, which would naturally be delayed due to the pandemic. But on the North American distribution side, 2017 is also when G-Kids obtained home video rights to the majority of the Studio Ghibli catalog, prompting the beginning of their own run of Blu-rays and Steelbook editions. Also in 2017 began the partnership with Fathom Events to host the Studio Ghibli Fest, theatrical reruns in movie theaters, and it's still ongoing at the time of this recording. In fact, it just wrapped. They only missed 2020, obviously, for the obvious reasons. And in 2018, Isao Takahata passed away from his battle with lung cancer at the age of 82. One of the founding members of Studio Ghibli was no more. There have been multiple exhibitions since honoring his memory. I don't want to get too much into the streaming side of things, but I will mention 2019 is when HBO or Max or whatever they're calling themselves now, the company acquired the streaming rights to the Ghibli catalog for North America. So they still retain it at the time of this recording. Netflix also obtained streaming rights for Lupin III, Castle of Cagliostro. 2020 saw the release of Earwig and the Witch, again directed by Goro Miyazaki, and was the studio's first theatrical film since When Marnie Was There in 2014. Also the first fully 3D CGI film in the studio's history. However, this movie was not what Studio Ghibli was looking for in terms of market or success. Reviews were not kind, and rightly so. This movie is kind of a mess. But jumping ahead to 2022, late 2022, Studio Ghibli Park opens after multiple delays, the themed areas and attractions based on the future films, and then 2023 saw the release of The Boy and the Heron. But leading up to this, we had on April 4th, the chairman of Studio Ghibli, Koji Hoshino, announced that he had stepped down and would leave the company entirely by June, just 1 month before the premiere of July's The Boy and the Heron. Hoshino had decided diminishing returns post-COVID, the delayed opening of the theme park, and the completion of Heron in his company departure address. But also, at the time, there were tabloid allegations against Toshio Suzuki, who had been allegedly mismanaging company funds, directed him towards his girlfriend since 2013. And so there was speculation that Hoshino was stepping down because he had finally gotten fed up with Toshio Suzuki. But despite the controversy, The Boy and the Heron enjoyed massive commercial success worldwide, taking home Best Animated Feature at both the Golden Globes and the Academy Awards. But also in October 2023, prompted by its aging founders, Studio Ghibli became a subsidiary under Nippon Television Holdings. Company leadership was then transferred to Nippon Television, with Toshio Suzuki staying on as a chairman and Hayao Miyazaki as an honorary chairman. And in 2024, at the 77th Cannes Film Festival, Studio Ghibli was awarded the honorary Palme d'Or, which is the highest prize awarded at the festival and one of the most prestigious awards in film. Now, this is typically awarded to a director, and so Studio Ghibli also broke ground by becoming the first production company to receive the honor. And since then, Miyazaki has announced that he's back at it with another film, titled to be determined at the time of this recording. He's also continues to work on short films for Ghibli Park, 2 of which are going to be showing at the park this summer, 2025. Goro Miyazaki has been looked at multiple times to succeed his father over the years, but let's just say the situation there is complicated. And we have the latest Isao Takahata exhibit opening in June 2025 at Tokyo's Azubadai Hills Gallery. This would have been his 90th birthday and also marks the 80th anniversary of World War II's end. Thus, Grave of the Fireflies is getting the star treatment this time at the exhibit, along with artwork from Pom Poko, Heidi, Anne, and others just across his whole catalog, but Grave of the Fireflies is getting the focus this time. As for what's next for Studio Ghibli, we will have to wait and see. Again, Miyazaki's working on another film, so look out for news on the new title and release date. You also have the museum and the theme parks. This is more of a brand management phase of the company rather than being a full-on theatrical production house. But I would like to think that there's still a bright future for the studio and the production house side of things. The anime industry was forever changed multiple times by Studio Ghibli, Takahata, Miyazaki, and so many people who worked at Ghibli and have now spread their talents through the industry. And while there's certainly a lot of built-up nostalgia for Ghibli specifically as a brand, I personally can't wait to see what could be coming next from the studio. And I think if they play their cards right, we could be seeing an entirely new era of Studio Ghibli beyond its founders for many years to come. And so for now, that is the story of Studio Ghibli. What are some of your favorite movies? Or is there anything you would like me to cover on the main show as far as any of their projects or people? Let me know down in the comments. You can find the show at Anime Field Guide by following the link tree, linktr.ee/ANI Field Guide. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, stay safe and watch more cartoons.